So, hello, good morning. Welcome to this webinar. So I'm EJ, I'm a lead consultant at Action Sustainability. I'm focusing in on human rights, modern slavery, due diligence and sustainable procurement. So for those of you who are not too familiar with Action Sustainability, we're globally recognized leaders in sustainable procurement and supply chain management. And we're also the delivery for the Supply Chain Sustainability School some of you may be a member of. In terms of me, I've been supporting organizations to develop more sustainable supply chains effectively for probably over 20 years now. Nowadays, I tend to spend most of my time working with all sorts of clients from built environment, financial services, facilities management, central government, local government, um, media companies, supporting them in their human rights due diligence, both in their own operations and in their supply chain. So that's me. And there's a Calendly QR code there. So if you want to book in a meeting, you can do that, and we'll share that at the end as well. So these are some of the clients we've supported recently to help them, I suppose, reduce, manage, and mitigate the risks of slavery and labour exploitation, helping them prepare for upcoming legislation and to develop ultimately more resilient and responsible supply chains. Little bit of background, so not background, a little bit of housekeeping. We're recording this session, so you'll get the recording afterwards. It's going to be quite pacey because we've got a lot to cover. So we will share the slides with you, we'll share the recording, and then we're going to be using Mentimeter as we go through. So that's to get you engaged, and we'll share all the results with you. If you've got any questions as we go through, you should see something like called the Q&A function on your screen. So if you click on Q&A, you can type in your questions there. We hope to have 5 minutes at the end for Q&A, so do put them in there. We're not going to stop during the presentation. So we've also muted your microphones because there are so many of you. I think we've got 50 at the moment. And if you have anything to share, any examples, any comments, please do use the chat function because that would be really helpful for you to share your insights, knowledge, case studies, or useful resources as well. So, signpost it to things that will help others. That would be really great. Let's manage expectations. The title of this webinar is quite big. We can't possibly cover all of those practical tips for everything related to procurement in 1 hour. So it's not a moon on a stick here. So just managing expectations. What we're going to do, start with some scene setting, making sure you're all really comfortable is probably the wrong word, but understand the current landscape of risk, including some case studies. We'll gallop through the business case. So why do we need to take action? We know it's the right thing to do, but what about the business drivers and how to articulate that when engaging with colleagues or the supply chain? And then it's what can we actually do through the procurement process, both thinking about supply and subcontract. Okay. So just to make sure we're all really clear on what modern slavery is, it's the illegal exploitation of people for commercial or personal gain. It's where victims are trapped in servitude, which they were deceived or coerced into and cannot leave. So it's that piece around feeling trapped and cannot leave, which is really important when we're talking about slavery. People feel that they have no choice but to stay in that situation because of the way they're being controlled or threatened. There's the wider exploitation spectrum where people are not being paid a fair wage, being forced to work long hours, but it's only modern slavery if they are in a situation which they cannot leave. And people who are victims of slavery have been targeted by exploiters because they are vulnerable. And very often exploiters will use their victims in more than one way. So there may be somebody who's forced to work as a cleaner, who's also sold off as a prostitute and also forced to commit crimes like stealing, drug running, pickpocketing. Exploiters don't see these victims as people, they just see them as a way to earn lots of money. Okay, so I'm going to get you to do some work. Can you go onto the Menti that's there now? So you either scan the QR code or type in menti.com, and then you've got the code there, 88280258. So I'm just going to change my screens around. Hopefully this will work. There we go. So the code's up there for you. Let me just take that one down. So I just want you to, let me get the QR code up again. Hold on, there you go. Sorry, if you haven't yet got onto the Mentimeter. Oh, sorry. There we go. So the QR code comes up. So, it's going to, you've got the code at the top, menti.com. And then I just want you to respond. So we have no way of knowing who said what on here. So just to get you thinking, which of the below statements do you think is correct? What do you think? The risks of modern slavery are prevalent in most supply chains. Sounds quite extreme, doesn't it? If we only work with reputable suppliers, the risks are low. Compliance with the Modern Slavery Act means a low risk of slavery. Which one do we think? There's a clear winner at the moment, isn't there? It's looking as though that first one. Okay, with a few of you thinking compliance with the Modern Slavery Act means low risk of slavery. Okay, so let's have a look. So yes, those of you who said the risks of modern slavery are prevalent in most supply chains, spot on. That is the case, unfortunately, and we'll look at why that is in a moment. Compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, to be honest, means very little. There is a very low bar set there. An organisation can be taking no steps to combat slavery, but can have a legally compliant statement. More about that later. So just a kind of a word of caution there. If you're talking to supply chain and they say, we're compliant with the Modern Slavery Act, doesn't really mean much at all. Now I'm trying to remember if there's another question here. No, don't answer that question yet. We'll save that for later. Okay, so I'm going to move that back over. So thank you. The next thing was a video I wanted to share with you. For some reason, the tech has failed us this morning. So I will share that with you afterwards, but it's a really hard-hitting video. It's looking at the construction sector, and it shows how a white British male is being exploited on a construction site. And I was showing this video, difficult because you haven't seen it, but I was showing this video to an infrastructure client the other day, and one of the procurement team said, but that's not realistic, is it, EJ? All of the victims in the UK are migrant workers, aren't they? This guy was British. So it does a good job of dispelling the myth. People think that, it's migrant workers. Migrant workers are high risk, but anybody can be vulnerable, and people who are vulnerable can be targeted and can become victims of modern slavery. I was with a survivor with lived experience the other day, a guy called Matt, a white British male who used to have his own construction company. He ended up having a relationship breakdown, lost his home, and ended up being a victim of forced labour. So be careful on, there's a lot of myths out there on thinking what a modern slavery victim looks like or acts like or so on. There were lots of signs that were missed. On this video, there were people around this guy who should have spotted that something wasn't right. He was being exploited. He was being charged recruitment fees. He was the first on site, last to leave every day. He looked like he got physical signs of being abused. All of those signs were there, but nobody spotted he was there. And he didn't actually realize he was a victim of slavery. He didn't realize he was being exploited. He thought he was lucky to get a job. It was only, after a certain amount of time, realizing he wasn't getting paid a fair wage, and he was having to pay more fees for his recruitment and his PPE and his contract than he was actually earning. So he was stuck in the cycle of debt. So it's thinking about, what could you do to prevent this from happening in your supply chain? Or if it is, what could you do to help find people and get them out of that situation? If you have a high risk supply chain, ask them, what are they doing to make sure that workers are aware of their rights and entitlements, that they're not paying for recruitment fees or paying for their uniforms or PPE? And again, we'll touch on this lots as we go through, but what grievance mechanisms are in place for them to flag concerns? And if so, are they easy to access? Are they available in different formats and different languages, like apps, posters? One organisation, one labour agency, I know they print how to report grievances on payslips, which is a really great idea. Do workers know that it's okay to report concerns and that there won't be any repercussions? So these are all kind of key things to think about when we've got high risk supply chain. It's all well and good to train people on how to spot the signs, but if they don't really believe there's a risk, then they won't be on the lookout for signs. Simple things can be impactful. Okay. So I will send that video to you afterwards, and so do have a look at that. The stats are horrendous. I mean, it's 50 million people globally in modern slavery. 28 million of those are estimated to be in forced labour. These numbers are growing because there is an increase in vulnerable people globally. We've got climate change, which is displacing people. We've got conflict, again, which is doing the same. And we have the cost of living crisis right here on our doorstep. So these numbers are increasing. So that phrase, we work with reputable businesses, so the risk in our operations or supply chain is low. Here's a few headlines to dispel this myth. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but just some of them. McDonald's. So this was in Cambridgeshire. I think this was about 6 months ago. A gang forced 16 victims to work at the fast food restaurant or at factories nearby, which supplied people like Asda, Co-op, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer, Tesco, Waitrose. There were well-established signs of slavery. All of the wages were being paid into the same bank account, but the basic signs were being missed. The work colleagues recognized that they were working long hours. They said that sometimes they'd sleep on the floor during lunch breaks and that they were working 17-hour shifts sometimes. Yet nobody reported a concern because they hadn't been trained in how to identify the signs of slavery and labour exploitation and the importance of flagging any concerns. You've got Operation Fort on the bottom right. I will circulate a report to you all about this. It's lessons learned, how businesses were infiltrated. Um, this was a Polish organized crime group that had 400 victims. They infiltrated all sorts of businesses, retailers. Biffa was one of those organizations and they're happy to talk about what happened to them. They had policies and processes in place, but their supply chains were still infiltrated. One of the ladies in the pictures there, she had infiltrated a recruitment agency. Um, and she was sending away genuine job seekers only to bring in those people who were victims to work on the sorting lines in the recycling centres. She was their go-to person for inductions, for grievances, and she was the only one who spoke Polish. Nobody else around her had a clue what was going on. You've got over 30 firms were infiltrated, large reputable firms in London and the Southeast under Operation Cardenas. And then you've got there, it was in the news, I think it was at the end of last year, around supermarkets. It was finding that lots of the tomatoes and their tomato purees and paste and tins had Uyghur forced labour in there. So you start looking for these cases, and there are so many out there. So let's have a think about high risk sectors. So what have we got on here? We got waste and recycling, cleaning, fruit picking. What do they all have in common? If we think about that, agency labour, low skilled labour, low paid labour. We might have transient temporary workers or high use of migrant labour as well, who might not understand what their rights and entitlements are. Often working at unusual times, hidden from public view, where it's less likely that somebody may notice that something isn't quite right. So, really high risk areas there. You've got electronics, IT, super high risk, especially when thinking about those international supply chains, especially around mining, processing of minerals like cobalt and copper, tungsten, tin. All of these are in our cars, our laptops, our lighting. So high chance that there will be slavery in the supply chains because we all use electronics. And you've got a mine on the right-hand side, which is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you have artisanal mines. Here they were mining for copper and cobalt. If you look into this, you find that there are women, children working in horrendous conditions, in toxic conditions, with no PPE. People regularly die because tunnels collapse, and they sell their cobalt or copper for about $2 a day. Sorry, $2 for a big, huge sack of cobalt. And it's in the supply chains, unfortunately, of things like renewable energy technologies, batteries, and so on. So this is just getting us thinking about how prevalent all of these risks are. And look, it's a highly profitable crime. The G20 countries are estimated to import 468 billion goods worth of products at high risk of forced labour. And at the bottom, you've got solar panels, textiles, electronics, palm oil as being some of the big high risk areas. Okay. This was in the news, I think it was last week. I thought this was really interesting. People tend to be quite aware now of the modern slavery risks in solar panels. People think about the Uyghur forced labor in China that links to the polysilicon. That's what most people I think are aware of, especially if you're buying renewable energy. What tends to be forgotten is the other risks around the installation and construction of solar farms. So here you'd got it was in India. It was one of the largest renewable energy parks being built, where they found allegations of slavery, forced labor, recruitment fees being paid, debt bondage, people working excessive hours. really poor tied-in accommodation, a lack of basic entitlements. Basically, migrant workers who've been enticed with this promise of a fantastic job, and when they get there, it's not what they signed up to, and their passports are confiscated. And this is very common, huge issues globally with this kind of abuse and exploitation. And especially when they're using labour agencies, there's that lack of accountability. We've handed it over to a labour agency to find workers. It's up to them to deal with these kind of issues. Um, we'll touch on what you can do as procurement a bit later. Malaysia, huge issues there with migrant workers from Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar. Promised a job, they arrive in Malaysia and then are forced to pay exorbitant recruitment fees, and it's set up so they can never pay them back. So they're stuck and they're trapped. Okay. So why does all of this matter? And I'm going to go back to Mentimeter now. Why does all of this matter? We know that taking steps to address modern slavery and labour exploitation, let's assume we know it's the right thing to do. There's an ethical imperative there. But what else? Imagine you're talking to a supplier and they're like, but we're compliant. Why does it matter? What could you say to them? How would you articulate that kind of business case? What do we think? Let me get the QR code up for you again. Reputation. Yes, reputation always comes up quite early, that reputational piece. Nobody wants to appear in the news, do they? There's been quite a few cases recently, and all sorts of one of the big Premier League football clubs, some high-end gyms in the UK. There's been luxury goods, there's been retailers. There's so many exposés and organisations that are kind of named and shamed. I know the British Army, Scottish Water were some of those that have been named as actually having, solar panels linked to Uyghur forced labour. And it's not these organisations condone saying that slavery is okay, it's they didn't know what was happening. So what have we got here? We've got reputation, it's the right thing to do, transparency. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, keep those coming. And I'll share that slide with you afterwards. But I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the drivers. One of them is legislation. However, as I said earlier on, the UK Modern Slavery Act, actually, it's very easy to be compliant. Businesses with a turnover of 36 million or above need to have a statement that talks about what steps they've taken historically to combat slavery. So what they've done in the last 12 months. However, if they say, we have taken no steps to combat slavery, and that statement is signed by the director, approved by the board, and on the website, it's legally compliant. However, there has been some recent guidance from the Home Office called Transparency in Supply Chains, which is fantastic. It's not mandated, but it talks about what a good modern slavery statement looks like. And it offers really practical advice as well, with this emphasis on transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. And it really focuses in as well on the role of stakeholder engagement and collaboration, including engaging with workers in your supply chain, competitors, trade unions, and people with lived experience of slavery and labour exploitation. And what there is in there is almost this kind of two levels of reporting. You've got level one and level two. And what we're starting to see is that procurement teams are starting to ask their supply chain, well, actually, on risk assessment, are you level one or level two in alignment with the Home Office guidance? So have a look at that. There's some really fantastic questions that you can think about including in your procurement processes. Okay. And the guidance as well challenges those myths that can hinder due diligence. It stresses that modern slavery risks, they exist everywhere and no organisation is exempt. So I love this quote. I'm sharing this quote all the time. Responsible organisations are those which acknowledge the risks, take active steps to identify and mitigate the risks, remediate harms, so that support those people impacted, and can demonstrate publicly that they are tracking progress and continuously improving. So not just demonstrate to internal stakeholders or clients, but publicly on your website, state what you're doing and what you're finding. Okay, so this is really important. So thinking about legislative landscape, the UK has just had, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here, don't worry, I'm not a legal expert, but the UK Joint Committee on Human Rights has just published a report in July on forced labour, stating that goods made with forced labour are still entering the UK market and that current legislation is inadequate. And it states that the UK is falling behind global peers and is risking becoming a dumping ground for goods produced with forced labour. One of the recommendations is the report is that the UK introduces human rights due diligence legislation for all companies with a proportionate requirement for smaller businesses as well. And that will come with financial penalties, seizure of goods for non-compliance, and import bans. And it also suggests introducing an import ban for products made with forced labour, which to me kind of seems like a no-brainer. Outside of the UK, you've got this tsunami of due diligence legislation that's coming in, or that's already there. Some examples there: Germany, France, Norway, EU, CS triple D, although that's a bit up in the air at the moment. You've got these import bans as well at the bottom, the EU forced labour ban and the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. So EU forced labour ban says that no products made using forced labour will be able to be sold, imported or exported in the EU from December 2027. And the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act have been in play now for quite a few years. That prohibits importing products made wholly or partly in the Xinjiang region of China because of the links to Uyghur forced labour, the state-imposed forced labour camps. And over the last 3 years, there's been 16,000 shipments have been detained, worth $3.7 billion worth of goods have been detained at the US border. So whilst we're in the UK and we have fairly low bar legislation, all of this international legislation here will be impacting our global supply chains. And I believe we will get some similar legislation coming to the UK at some point. So we need to think about supply chains are going to be disrupted. There's potential for financial impacts, reputational risks, and so on. Some of the fines for Germany, for example, I think the fine is 2% of global turnover if you are seen to not be doing your due diligence. Okay, and more about what that actually means in a second. Looking at the business case as well, we've got increased investor scrutiny. CCLA Investment, again, I'll send you links to this. They look after about £15 billion worth of assets, and each year they publish a modern slavery benchmark. You can look at this in your own time, but you can imagine how this is driving change. Nobody wants to be up there listed as unsatisfactory. You've got Rathbones as well, who have a campaign, an investor coalition all around modern slavery as well. So there's a growing drive from investors thinking about ESG. Health and safety as well. That's an almost kind of back to basics. If we've got people working in our supply chains who are not trained, who are tired or exhausted, malnourished, then there's health and safety risks there as well. And also quality impacts. If you think about if you're on a construction site and you've got people who are not trained in dangerous jobs, risk of health and safety, but also, you know, the quality of the work is going to be poor because people aren't trained. Okay, so let's jump back onto Menti. Hopefully now you're getting a bit more familiar with how to use all of this. So let's have a look. Let's jump on to the next one. I've forgotten myself what this question is. Let's see. Oh, okay, there we go. Let's start. So we can assure you there is no slavery in our supply chain, as our suppliers have signed up to our terms and conditions, which includes zero tolerance to slavery. Is that good due diligence or a red flag? What do we think? A red flag. Okay, fantastic. You got that. Okay, that's good. Because as we know, that's just one aspect of due diligence up front, but it's how you embed that into the contract as well. Okay, next one. If we find cases of slavery in our supply chain, we'll terminate the contract immediately and cut ties. What do we think? Got a timer on there as well, 6 seconds left. Red flag or good due diligence? Okay, interesting. It's actually a red flag. If you find cases of slavery in your supply chain and you just cut ties because you're like, we don't want to be linked to that, you know, our reputation, and we don't want to be seen, thinking that that's okay. How is that helping those people who are victims? who are in that supply chain. It's not helping them, is it? So the key thing, if you do find cases in your supply chain, work with that supplier to understand what's happening, why it's happening. Were you in any way causing or contributing to that situation? For example, asking for something to be, delivered super quickly or at a really low cost that actually means it can't be made without exploitation in there. Have a look at what you could maybe do to prevent that from happening again, but then work with that supply chain to support those people impacted, whether that's through, financial compensation, supporting with getting them back into the situation they were in, reimbursing recruitment fees and so on. Obviously, that's hugely complex. I'm not saying that's simple, but the worst thing you can do is just cut ties. And when I show you some slides about due diligence, this will all make a bit more sense as well. Okay, so thank you. Let's go on to the next one here. So due diligence is an ongoing risk management process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how adverse impacts are addressed in the organisation and business associates. It's not zero slaves here, okay? It's recognising there's likely to be something there and to look for it. So this is an example. First Solar is a solar PV company. I think you probably know, or you probably get where I'm going with this one. First Solar did some audits of their Malaysian supply chain, and they found cases of forced labour and labour exploitation for their subcontracted migrant workers. Rather than burying that and trying to not let anybody know about that, they openly reported what they found. They then investigated why did that happen in the first place? What could be done to prevent that from happening again? And what steps are being taken now? And proactively looked at how they could support those people impacted. And they got really positive coverage for doing so, because this is what due diligence is. It feels awkward because you think, well, actually, surely there should be nothing in my supply chain. But actually, due diligence is about recognize it will be there, and do everything you can with what leverage you have to find it and fix it, which is a very simple phrase. Supply chain transparency is about know and show. It's not about know and hide. It's know what's out there and then show. Um, Very simple phrase. So keep that in our minds. And when we're talking to our supply chain, it's making this part of the conversation. We know there are risks there. What do they look like? And let's get comfortable in sharing those risks. So find it, fix it, prevent it. Don't stick your head in the sand and pretend nothing here, because it's so prevalent. Okay, so that's a nice simple phrase, or you can use that longer phrase that we looked at earlier on to define due diligence. So where you have high risk supply chain, you should be asking them about all of these things on here: leadership and commitment, risk assessment and setting priorities. How are they training their own teams? How are they training their supply chain to understand these risks and respond to the risks? What have they got from a recruitment and employment relations perspective? How are they making sure that everyone involved in recruitment understands how to spot the signs of slavery and how prevalent it is and how to report concerns? What are they doing in their own supply chain? What do they have in place should somebody come forward as a victim? That's the grievance and remediation piece. How are they measuring and reporting this? So the when you're if you as your own organization are high risk of slavery, these are things you need to be on top of and have spend time and resource and budget. But if you have high risk supply chain, these are all the kinds of things you should be asking them about. So more about that in a moment. Okay, so what we've got here is the procurement cycle on the outside and different stages of due diligence on that inner circle, which maps out kind of what you do and at which stage of procurement. So it's a strategic approach. Gone are the days where procurement is just about lowest cost, that kind of transactional procurement. I feel sorry for anyone in procurement. You have to, think about carbon, you have to think about waste, biodiversity and human rights. So you need that strategic approach. So upfront in procurement, you'll understand the concept of understanding the need. So at the beginning of any procurement process, understanding that business need is essential. Typical business considerations like quality, performance, life cycle costing. But it's here that we can start to think about how to reduce the risks of slavery and think about how can we design out risk or reduce or mitigate risks right up front. For example, Let me think. So, is there an opportunity to avoid procuring a category at high risk of containing slavery? So, really simplified example. If there is a product being specified using marble that's only from certain high risk geographies, then could a lower risk material be substituted instead? Um, could you get the same outcome by buying in a different way? So, for example, lease instead of buy, lease versus buy, or using a more innovative technology. At this stage, again, it's just good sustainable procurement. It's about engaging the market, talk to the market, find out what's their maturity around modern slavery due diligence, what standards they're using, what what level of transparency do they have in their supply chains? Are there any collaborations already in place? And all of this helps, again, this basic good procurement. All of this means that what you ask for in your procurement process is realistic and achievable, and that you're doing your due diligence up front. It also signals to the supply chain that you're keen to collaborate with them as well. Okay. Um, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, so I'll move on at this stage. So this prioritize circularity, this has its own slide because circular economy is absolutely key to designing out the risk of modern slavery. Again, think about construction. I know lots of you here today are in construction. The most definitive way to reduce forced labour risks within construction is to prioritise a circular economy when we're thinking about material supply chains. A circular economy helps reduce waste, reduce global CO2. And if we think building materials supply chains, the highest risk is often upstream at the point of raw material extraction or mining. So that circular economy approach up front helps reduce reliance on um, those minerals which have high risk activities. I read about a Dutch company recently that has made a repairable and recyclable solar panel, which is a good example because there's lots of human rights and modern slavery issues, as well as environmental issues linked to end of life. So again, we're here to talk about modern slavery, but step back and think if we're developing that balanced and effective procurement strategy, we need to understand the wider social, environmental, and economic impacts of the product or service. We need to think about carbon, we need to think about waste, we need to think about water, um, land rights, and so on. If we focus in on just one of these areas, for example, climate and carbon, which happens a lot, this move towards a low carbon economy. So it's about low carbon, low carbon. But if we forget about the impact on people, we don't end up with a sustainable solution. Huge issues in renewable energy at the moment in terms of the supply chains being riddled with human rights abuses. So we need to get better at how we address that. So, how do we identify risk? We've kind of talked about this earlier on. So there will always be a risk of labour exploitation and slavery where you've got low skilled or low paid work, use of temporary or transient workers, where you've got vulnerable workers, migrant labour, contract or agency workers. If you're sourcing from a country that's known to be high risk or where they have poor human rights legislations in place. And then also this one here, where there are skills or material shortages or supply chain disruption. So if we think about at the moment in the UK, there's a huge issue with slavery and labour exploitation in adult social care and in construction because we have a shortage of skills. And where there is a shortage of skills, the increase in modern slavery rises because we just need people quickly. And very often the due diligence checks that we should be doing fall through the nets, and it happens in our supply chains. And where you have disruptions to your supply chains, think back to COVID, everybody needed PPE. What happened? We ended up with all sorts of issues with PPE made in with using slavery and labor exploitation because things were needed quickly. So people ask less questions rather than more. So just beware, as soon as there's a material shortage or a supply chain's disrupted, that's where you really need to be doing heightened due diligence. Okay. There are lots of resources to help with risk identification. Here are some. So that 2024 list of goods or produced with child labour or forced labour, it's really practical. It's used by the US government, but also recommended by UK government as well. You've got design for freedom if you're in the construction sector, understanding modern slavery risks. So we developed that through the Supply Chain Sustainability School last year. really practical. It's got a section for SMEs as well. And then if you're concerned about the Uyghur forced labor in China, have a look at the Helena Kennedy Centre and Sheffield Hallam reports on automotive, garments, and renewable energy sectors, really useful. Okay, so once you've identified the risks, you probably feel a bit overwhelmed because you think, well, gosh, there's risks in so many places. So we need to recognize you can't address every single risk. It's about taking that proportionate, pragmatic approach and prioritizing where you will focus your efforts. A risk-based, prioritized approach is absolutely key. So when you're doing this, you need to think about the scale or magnitude of the risk. You often hear the phrase saliency. So this is about the severity of the risk to people and communities impacted. Traditionally, businesses, when they think about risk, they often think about risk to business operations and financial performance. Very real risks, yes. But we need to look at this through a double materiality lens, thinking about risks to people outside of our own organization, including those deep in the value chain. That's what due diligence legislation requires us to do. So the concept of leverage, again, you're most of you procurement people, so you'll be very familiar with using your influence, your negotiation power and resources to achieve a specific outcome. And again, traditionally, leverage in procurement is determined using financial indicators, contract value, for example. But there are other considerations, is the length of relationship, for example, are you buying a one-off purchase or is it part of a program of work that includes longer term relationships with your suppliers? And if it's the former, can you collaborate with others to develop that longer term kind of program of work where you'd have more leverage to influence change? Think about innovation. So if you're a larger organization or you have funds or ambitions to support innovation and continuous improvement in the supply chain, then that's a way to look at how, over the long term, how you can reduce and mitigate the risks. And think about, resilience. Do you have the freedom and flexibility to move supply chains if unsatisfied with your supply chain's approach to addressing the risk of modern slavery and labor exploitation? So leverage is complex and you have to tailor your approach depending on how much leverage you have, but also think about how you can increase your leverage as well. And also, lastly, the scope the market has to do better. So it's about being aware. It goes back to that pre-market engagement, being aware of what the market's capable of at the moment. There's no point demanding, transparency across all tiers of the supply chain if that if businesses are really not there yet. But what you can do is work with them to help build in that continuous improvement. Okay. So once you've gone through that process, your risk identification and assessment, that should inform your entire risk-based procurement strategy. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the idea is you'd have your green, which is your low risks, your amber, your medium risks, and your red, which is your high risk. Where you have those red high risks and you've got the potential to influence change, this is where you need to be thinking about using your leverage. This is where you need to be thinking about supply chain mapping, about social audits, about really using supplier relationship management, collaborating with your supply chain. Supply chain mapping, everyone's talking about supply chain mapping, aren't they? It's really complex and sorry to disappoint for those of you who think there's probably a tech tool out there that will do it all for you. There's a huge role for technology to play here, but tools rely on the right data being input into them. And one of the big challenges with supply chain mapping is your supply chain feeling comfortable enough to share what they see as commercially sensitive data with you, just at that first tier. That in itself is a challenge. So it's so key to build that trust and collaborative approach with your supply chain, but that's jumping ahead to the contract management piece. So let's think about supplier selection. Have a think about, now we know what due diligence looks like, what kind of questions could we ask in supplier selection? So do you want to share? Oh, there we go. We've got a little leaderboard there. Forgot about that. So well done, whoever won that. Is that Watson? Oh, yeah, Watson, well done, otherwise known as watermelon. Okay, right. So next one. What due diligence questions could you ask? Think about pre-qualification, think about the tender process. What kind of questions could you ask? What do you think? Just going to get that QR code up there for you again. Yeah, what processes do you have in place? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, certifications and assurances. Yeah, there's a huge role to play. Lots of certifications out there. Certifications will never provide assurance of zero forced labour, but again, they are one kind of tool to use in a wider toolkit. Provision of modern slavery statements. Yeah, absolutely. Do you subcontract? And if so, how do you build in due diligence into those subcontracts? Yep. Has your company visited the site to audit for modern slavery? Do you use labour agencies? Training? What information is available to your employees regarding their rights? I love that one. Fantastic. Yep. What geographies or what locations of your suppliers? How do you signpost to independent, anonymous help? Yes, whistleblower numbers and so on. What's diversity and equality of your supply chain? Yeah, keep these coming. All of these are really good. You can keep that going in the background. So, oh, so the kind of considerations we need to be thinking about here and building this into the questions we ask is it's about beyond compliance. There's no point asking, well, you can ask, are you compliant with the Modern Slavery Act? But it doesn't mean that much. It's about building in those wider due diligence questions and continuous improvement. I would say avoid demands or requests for assurance of zero forced labour because rarely is that actually possible. That's almost like a bit of a red flag, I would say, if somebody says, well, assurance of zero forced labour, they probably don't understand how ingrained it is into so many of the things that slide textiles, solar panels, electronics, and so on. So try and build in. So if your supply chain mapping is really important, you need to build, and actually you're at your supply chain mapping now up to tier two. So work towards supply chain mapping to further tiers and build that into the contract. And use the language of due diligence so that what steps are you taking to identify, prevent, manage, and mitigate the risks? So think about those kind of things when we're talking about the supplier selection process. Here's an example question here. We're committed to preventing, identifying, managing, and mitigating the risks. What are you going to do to support us with this commitment? Okay, so these are just examples to get you thinking. And again, coming back to this slide, features of a good response are all here. They'll be talking about what they're doing in each of these areas, risk assessment, what methodology they're using, how they're engaging stakeholders, what resources they're using to help assess the risks, how are they engaging with their supply chain stakeholders to understand the risks. And again, on the flip side, if businesses are coming back saying, oh, we've got a policy, but it's just a generic cut and paste policy. A modern slavery policy should be linked into other policies within your organization. Your responsible recruitment, your procurement, your payment, your equality, diversity, and inclusion, your whistleblowing. They should all link in together rather than modern slavery being seen as this thing over there that's dealt with by that part of the business. If you're working with high risk supply chain suppliers or subcontractors, they their leadership and commitment is critical in this. So it's about asking questions, where does responsibility sit for this within your organization? What about oversight? How are you reviewing, monitoring, and ensuring continuous improvement each year? And again, all of these are things that should be appearing in a modern slavery statement as well. Okay. Other examples of questions. So this is taken, there is a toolkit that I wrote through the Supply Chain Sustainability School, looking at operational risks on site. These are the key risks on construction sites in the UK. So here are some example questions. How will you manage and mitigate these risks? Workers being unaware of basic entitlements, cultural and language barriers, organizations not being set up to deal with suspicions of slavery. So these are types of questions you can start to ask and get comfortable with asking as well. Support with contract clauses, I would signpost you to the responsible contracting project. It's really practical guide there. Some of you may already be familiar with it. But again, if any of you have got ideas and suggestions, do feel free to share those in the chat. Some examples of good practice. So the one here on the left is some guidance that myself and my colleagues wrote at Action Sustainability a few years ago. Um, this was in collaboration with some organisations like Sky, DEFRA, Environment Agency, Balfour Beatty, local authorities, and some smaller organisations as well. And it's quite a chunky document, but hopefully you can jump into the bits that you want to look at quite easily. It's got templates in there for supply chain mapping, questions you can ask through the procurement process. It's got the kind of red flags, the enablers piece, so what you need from a policy perspective, from a governance oversight, the role of audits. It looks at remediation. So it's really good practice procurement. And it says it's for solar PV, but you could use that when procuring renewable energy technologies as well, because many of the issues are very, very similar. There's the Home Office Transparency and Supply Chains Guidance we talked about earlier, and ETI base code as well. So there are some resources. But again, do message me if you want to be signposted or support in any of these areas. Contract management, we're nearly there. Contract management, this is an area that is neglected in most sectors. We do lots of gap analysis and benchmarking of organisations on their modern slavery due diligence approach, and this is the bit that people tend to kind of score quite poorly. So, what can you do when you're thinking about contract management? Really key to set a collaborative tone. Don't risk dump. I speak to organizations, and I'll be like, what are you doing in your supply chain? Well, I've told them they need to align with our code of conduct or else we're going to cut ties. That's not collaborative. Be collaborative, don't risk dump because we recognize there are risks there. You want your supply chain to be honest with you. So commend that open and honest dialogue. So if you remember First Solar, I had that headline as an example of good due diligence. If they were in your supply chain, it would be about saying, to them, we recognize that was really honest, and we're grateful for you to having shared that. Embed the requirements into the contract. Absolutely critical. Again, basic procurement. Don't just ask for things up front and then forget to build them in the contract. Build in key performance indicators, build in those performance reviews, build in the requirement to use certifications, standards, audits, and so on, with that focus on continuous improvement. And for those people who are responsible for managing those contracts, make sure they're really trained and understand, first of all, the business case, why this is so important, so that when they're talking to the supply chain, they can drop in the kind of, responsible business, responsible supply chains is resilient supply chains. There's risk to reputation, there's financial implications. Investors are asking us about this. So they're comfortable with talking about the risks of modern slavery, but also that they're reviewing the risks regularly. It's just another point on the agenda. So it doesn't feel that you're kind of pointing the finger at the supplier and the supplier's like, oh, why are they asking me about this? It just becomes business as usual. And also engage and educate. So many of the clients we work with, for example, Balfour Beatty, they will regularly bring together people in their own organization, procurement, contract management, and their supply chain to upskill them on human rights and modern slavery due diligence. So it's a clean, kind of collaborative approach. Okay. And some examples of supplier development activities where you do have high risk suppliers. And again, you'll be doing this already with suppliers who are high risk for other kind of sustainability issues. So it's not new, but it's just thinking about doing the same for modern slavery as you may already be doing for carbon or quality or waste. Okay. KPIs, lots of people struggle with this. Like, well, how do we measure and report progress here? This is just a kind of a smattering of some KPIs that you might want to think about. There's lots more. And again, it depends on the nature of your business and your supply chain and where the risks are. But here are just some examples. Percentage of suppliers who've started mapping their high risk supply chains and shared results with you. That's a really good one. Percentage of supply chain with grievance mechanisms in place. Percentage of tier one or tier two who've had social audits. Again, focusing in on the high risk areas. And then collaborate and advocate. The challenge of modern slavery is too big for organisations to tackle alone. So there's just some examples of collaborations here. Let's have a look what we've got. So International Accord. I don't know if we've got anyone from kind of garment sector on the call today, but the International Accord has grown from, it was known as the Bangladesh Accord, which was a legally binding agreement between international brands and trade unions, looking at ensuring safe and healthy working conditions for garment workers in Bangladesh to avoid labour exploitation as well. It was established following the collapse of Rana Plaza, which was a huge disaster in 2013 in Bangladesh. I think it killed over about 1,000 garment workers. So industry came together after that to say, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen ever again? So the Accord mandates the improvement of factory safety, health standards, workers' rights, and this collaboration is one of the most effective labour rights initiatives in Bangladesh. So it's about how we can collaborate. Just to think which other ones here. Solar Stewardship Initiative, that's an example in solar supply chains. You've got the Modern Slavery Intelligence Network. This is an online database used by 14 large UK food and agricultural sector organisations, big names you would have heard of, to share data and intelligence. And this data sharing, it helps its members prevent and mitigate risks of slavery in their supply chains through that kind of collective knowledge and coordinated investigations with law enforcement. So, if you have high risk suppliers, are they involved in any of these kind of initiatives? You've got the Built Environment Against Slavery group, which is a group I lead. We've got 90 organisations working together to drive a more collaborative approach to how they engage their supply chain around these challenges and issues, and understand what resources do they need to support them. And Electronics Watch as well, fantastic program there. Its mission is to use public procurement leverage to promote and protect the rights of workers in global supply chains. So collaboration is absolutely key. Audits. When often I ask businesses in workshops, what does due diligence mean? Audits comes up there in big letters. People think audits, yeah, we've done audits, so we're okay. Audits is just one tool. It's not a substitute for human rights due diligence. It has a huge role to play, but social audits as well, they're not always going to uncover the things that might be happening. An example here, just before COVID, Top Glove had been awarded an A rating in a social audit. And then sure enough, it was found to be using forced labour in its Malaysian supply chain. So there's some tips there around audits, engaging the workers, the rights holders, focus on continuous improvement. I think very often when we're auditing our supply chain, sometimes we're going in there just to tick to find everything's okay. The kind of compliance approach, whereas we need to think about where are things not as good as they could be, and actually how are we going to support them to improve that? So again, a change of mindset, thinking about collaboration rather than finger pointing and blame. And be prepared to work with supplier on actions how to improve. Remediation. I think this is my last slide before we just see if there's any Q&A. So again, if you have any questions, do pop those into the Q&A box or the chat. Remediation. So this is if something is found, if victims are found or cases of labour exploitation or abuse, be prepared. A colleague of mine had somebody call her a few years ago from a big business saying, Helen, we found somebody. She's like, why are you calling me? I did some training for you as a consultant a long time ago. They weren't prepared. So be prepared for if slavery or labour exploitation is found in your supply chain. What's your process? What are you going to do? Be prepared for that. Have a remediation policy and strategy that talks, and make sure that policy and strategy puts victims first. It's about putting the victim at the center of your response. If you talk to any survivors of modern slavery, they will say, so often people think they know what a victim needs to support them, or, and decisions are made for them without their consultation. So every victim or survivor is different, and it's critical to engage those survivors, or work with your supply chain to engage them to find out what do they need, what does remediation look like for them. Again, you can't do this alone, and prevention is the best form of remedy. And there are lots of organisations out there, and case studies on remediation. Again, I'll send some links through to you. Align, Causeway, Bright Future. some examples of organisations here in the UK. Lots of case studies. I know Electronics Watch did a good case study quite recently on remediation in practice, paying back recruitment fees, and so on. Again, I can circulate that with you if you're interested. And lastly, at Action Sustainability, we do a lot of work supporting organisations to assess and benchmark where they're at on this journey. And this is a model that we've developed. So we look at the kind of three chunks: the leadership and commitment, which is that it's the enablers, it's what you need to have in place if you're going to be effective in your due diligence, then the modern slavery due diligence, and then that kind of responding to the grievance and remediation. So we work with a lot of businesses, do that gap analysis, engage with people across their organization and supply chain, and then come up with these action plans to help them improve. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so I am going to stop sharing my screen and jump into, hold on a second. Let me get Zoom up and see if I can find any questions that have come through. Oops. Bear with me, everything's gone a bit wonky. Okay. So Keegan, I can't see the Q&A coming up. Hold on a sec, let me, found it. Okay, so Q&A. Okay, so Sharon, you've got a question. Can the transparency and supply chains guidance be used globally or only with UK-based companies? So the guidance itself aligns with best practice frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, OECD guidance. So again, don't worry if you've not heard about that, but these are best practice. So the questions in there, they could be used anywhere. They are just good practice. There's nothing in there that I can think of that's actually specific to the UK other than the bit around producing modern slavery statements. And again, when you look at the TIS guidance, it's recommending businesses to share their findings. And again, linking back to the CCLA, do you remember I talked about one of the investors, CCLA investment, do that modern slavery benchmark? They've shared their methodology, their assessment methodology. You can all go on there and have a look at that. And if you have in your modern slavery statement, if you've disclosed cases or concerns that you found, you get a point. If you haven't found anything that is any concern, you don't get a point. So again, it feels strange, but it's about moving towards getting more comfortable with there are risks. We need to all get better at sharing what those are. Tell our peers and others. I know it's easy to say, but people worry for many reasons, but that is the direction of travel. Do you recommend positives and negatives re modern slavery and supply chain to be publicised? I think that links to the question, well, what I've just touched on. Businesses, in alignment with the transparency and supply chains guidance, are being asked to share what they're finding. But what's the important piece is if you're finding concerns or cases, then what steps are you taking to address that? So that's the key piece. But yes, I would recommend sharing the positives and negatives. The problem, as always, though, one of the problems is that we're still fairly immature in this area. Think about what we were like before health and, health and safety used to be something that people did, as a kind of, I mean, talking years ago. But now it's business as usual. And then carbon was something we all had to think about. And then human rights and modern slavery came a bit later. Um, but people disclose things around health and safety on their sites. They have to. So it's about getting comfortable about sharing the things that aren't so great. And I would say from a collaborative perspective, the Built Environment Against Slavery group that I run with the supply chain school, it's about where we share actually what are the challenges we're facing, what are we finding in our supply chains. And in the same way, if anyone's interested in solar PV and worried about that, involved in procuring solar PV or renewable energies, we have a Chatham House group from across the value chain that meet together to address that. We're about to do some work on looking at the risks around batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels. If you're interested in getting involved in that, again, please do contact me. Claire, yes. Did you say you will share links to all the resources mentioned in the presentation? I will, and more. I'm all for, there's lots of good resources out there. I will be sharing them and signposting to them. Are there any tools for local authorities to use for contract management? Omar, if you message me, I will get back to you on that because yes, there are. Um, Richard, okay, I work for an SME. Slavery awareness action is one of the many responsibilities I have. Is there an appropriate template policy and procedure I can access to help benchmarking? I feel like that's a planted question because on the 14th of October, through the Supply Chain Sustainability School, again, we'll send you a link to that. We are about to launch a free modern slavery due diligence assessment and action planning tool with resources to help, and everything is available for free. And it aligns with the transparency and supply chains guidance. So I will send that through to you. But Richard, I would say have a look in the Supply Chain Sustainability School. There's lots to help in there in terms of what a good policy looks like, but things that are appropriate for an SME, because it all comes back to having that proportionate approach. And you're an SME, so you can't be, you don't have the resource that the larger organizations have. So your approach needs to be proportionate, but there are certainly things you can do. Are there any groups where we could be part of in the food industry? Yes, there are. There are lots. Louise Nichols is involved, I think, in many of those. But I will have a look again. Keegan, if we could make sure we've got a note of these questions, and then I can get back to you with signposting. So um, email me directly and I'll get back to you. And Hayley, you've said about Omar's questions about tools for local authorities. So Hayley, again, contact me. Um, yes, and Desna. Okay, so what I'm going to do, just share my screen again, because I think we're probably coming up to time, is on this QR code. Hold on. Sorry, I can't talk and do things at the same time. Bear with me. um, my last slide. Am I sharing that, Keegan? Yes, I am. If you scan that QR code there on the beneath my photo, you can book in a meeting with me there. A free kind of modern slavery discovery call. It can be about future support. It can be questions about anything we've talked about today, but very happy for you to get in touch with me. We've gone over by 2 minutes, so apologies for that. Please do share your feedback. We'd love to know what you enjoyed about today, what you think we could have done differently. I know it was a race through because there's a lot to cover, and this is a huge topic. I run workshops that are 4.5 hours on this and more and wider engagement. So we've really just kind of scratched the surface, but I hope you found it useful. So thank you, everybody.